Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we're going over The One Thing by Gary Keller and Jay Papasan, going over Chapter 8 of the section titled The Lies That They Tell You About Success, and Chapter 8 being all about a balanced life. And it's funny because I was meeting up with a friend yesterday, and I mentioned this phrase like, oh, I got to have more balance in my life. I actually said that to him. And then rereading this chapter, going through it, made me realize, oh, wow. If you ever want to go anywhere in your life, you're going to have to be out of balance. If you ever want any sort of success in a skill set, in a workplace, business, maybe relationship, things are going to be out of balance at some points. And what Gary and Jay talk about in the book, in this chapter, is it's performing a balancing act and not being in a state of balance. So they switch it from like a verb to a noun. How I was speaking to my friend about it was a noun. I want to be in balance. I got to have a balanced life. Gary switches it, and it's more like a verb. You're balancing, you're juggling, and that's okay. But the trick is to then counterbalance, and we're going to talk about that in this episode today, about counterbalancing between your one thing and your everything else, your personal life, what have you. So let's kick things off. Nothing ever achieves absolute balance, says Gary. And this is what I had just mentioned just a moment ago. There's really, the lie stems from looking at balance as a noun, the state of being in balance, when nothing's ever really in complete balance. You're really always trying to balance certain things. Like your body is constantly at work. The cells, membranes, your heart rate, everything's always kind of in flux, hovering around a certain mean, but it's ebbing and flowing back and forth through this line. It's kind of like a sine. Would that be a sine wave? Think about like a tidal wave where it goes under and it's coming up and it's going under and it's coming up, right? That's more so what balancing is. And what Gary says is balance doesn't exist. The state of being in constant balance, 50-50, it doesn't exist. But people are seeking it all the time. All the time. But it doesn't exist because just by nature of spending time on one thing means that you're spending time away from another thing. That's out of balance. You're not in balance there. So that's what Gary says here. A balanced life is a lie. And he says extraordinary results require focused attention and time. Time on one thing means time away from another thing. This makes balance impossible. Let's continue forward. The genesis of this myth. How did this really all start? Well, if you think about the past, early humans, and maybe like early civilization, if you didn't work, you didn't live long. So you had to be kind of constantly working at something just to survive, whether that was out hunting and gathering or agriculturally. The things that you did in your life were never things that you do for leisure or getting ahead. They were things that you did just for survival. Putting together a shelter, going out hunting for food, or planting seeds, crops, what have you, and gathering that just to survive to the next day. So you can imagine things were way out of balance back then. Wouldn't you say? Or maybe there just wasn't a concept of balance back then. Because what were you balancing? You were surviving. That's not just balance, it's survival. And what happened was farming societies gave rise to professional specialization, says Gary. So, and he puts it kind of simply in the book, we were either farmers or fed by farmers. And some people worked to put food on our tables and other people built the tables. But having this agricultural society gave rise to people who could then pursue these other sorts of professions, the people that build the tables. Right? So people used to work just based on their needs, like the need for survival. Like if you were, he gives an example of not a 19th century. I mean, maybe 19th century, but if you were like a blacksmith in the medieval ages, you worked as long as you needed to work to procure enough resources to then buy just enough food to survive for the immediate short term. And that's all you worked, and that's all you needed to work. But then what started happening is people started to work for other people, right? Now you're working based on a schedule, 40-hour work week. Now you're on time. You're working on a timed schedule. Now you have time to do other stuff in your life. So that other stuff in your life has now brought up this whole term of work-life balance. The schedule and like the factory worker punch in, punch out has now allowed for you to pursue other things outside of your life. And with the advent of just technologies and again, this agrarian farming society where food is more abundant now than it was back then, you're not really so much worried as this day-to-day survival. So now you have free time. And now this is when work-life balance comes into place, which wasn't even a term until around the mid-1980s. And Gary talks how there's really this coinkydink, this ramp-up of technology coincides with the rise in belief that something is missing in our lives. Well, yeah, because technology has made things so much easier that we're running around trying to figure out, hey, since we're not struggling, what the hell do we do with our lives now? Whereas before, you weren't really worried about that because you needed to just fight for survival. But now, it's not really a thing like that anymore. And there's actually a chart on page 75, The Rise of the Work-Life Balance Myth, and it's a chart with years on the x-axis and the number of times work-life balance is mentioned in newspaper and magazine articles. And in recent years, around the time when this book was written, it's just exploded from like the mid-1980s. It's just on this upward, if you guys could see that, upward trajectory, number of times it's mentioned. Next slide. Middle mismanagement. So Gary talks about, he writes, the desire for balance makes sense. Enough time for everything and everything done in time. It sounds so appealing, but it's not. If you think that being in balance is being in the middle, and in the Bible, Solomon says you got to walk between the two pillars. Boaz and I forget the other pillar's name, but when they were building the Temple of Solomon and he'd got the two pillars, Boaz and Jeroboam. I forget. I'm going to have to look that up again. So if balance is the middle, then out of balance must mean you're away from the middle. You're living at the extremes. Living in the middle prevents you from making extraordinary time commitments. And when you have a one thing, you have to make extraordinary time commitments. It's going to happen. You're going to be out of balance, and that's okay. And Gary has this great line where he says, attend to all things and everything gets shortchanged. Right? You try to catch 2 rabbits, you end up catching none. So really, that's really the crux of Gary's whole argument this chapter is knowing that balance is a verb and not a noun. And it really comes down to knowing when to be in the middle and knowing when to be at the extremes. And it's not so much balancing, but it's counterbalancing. Because the magic and the skill set improvement or the real success is at the extremes. If you want big success. But what happens at those extremes is you mismanage your time when you're out there. Again, by not prioritizing things and not working on your one thing. He calls it middle mismanagement. Once you're at those extremes, you're mismanaging your time. You're not working on your one thing. So then you get stressed and overworked, doing all the things except your one thing. Then you feel like you can't catch up. Oh, I'm working too much. I'm not seeing my family, etc., etc., etc. When you are working on your one thing and you're making progress, yes, you're going to be out of balance. Maybe you might not see your friends for a while or your family for a while. But then by virtue of working on your one thing, you feel okay bringing it back to the middle and then having time for your friends and family. Counterbalancing it. Gary brings up a good point in this section. Time waits for no one. How I've said this before, just with spending money, and I used to be like habitually just not want to spend any money, not want to go anywhere. Any money I would put towards like retirement, investments, etc. But now I'm realizing, and there's this quote that you don't want to be the richest guy in the graveyard. Right? You got all that money, but then you save it with you till you die, and then what? You can't use it. Postponement can become permanent. So Gary tells a story about a couple saving for retirement. They're working really, really hard, saving, and then all of a sudden the wife actually passes away, sadly. So all this hard work and money that was going to go to this couple spending their golden years together in retirement, well, now they can't. So you don't get those years back. It's a gamble. Gary says gambling with your time is a bet you may not be able to recover from. I'm paraphrasing. It's not a direct quote, but it's very similar to what was in the book. And I've used this example in just the previous slides. It's not so much about balancing, but it's about counterbalancing. And he illustrates this with a ballerina example. When the ballerina poses and point, she can appear weightless, floating on air, the very idea of balance and grace. But a closer look would reveal her toe shoes vibrating rapidly, making minute adjustments for balance. Counterbalancing done well gives the illusion of balance. So it's knowing when to be at the extreme and then bringing it back to the middle. And then bringing it to the extreme again and then bringing it back to the middle and making those micro adjustments and being in the state of counterbalancing. That's not the right way to phrase it. Being the act of balancing, not the state of balance. And that leads us to this next slide. Out of balance. When is somebody out of balance? And again, it's when some priorities are being underserved or unmet. Again, you're not prioritizing. You're making lists of random things that don't really need to get done, and you're not working on your one thing. You can feel out of balance. You can't get everything done, and you can't leave everything undone. So what needs to get done? Things related to your one thing. Things that are related to that one thing. Sorry, I just repeated myself. But it's worth repeating. That's what you should be focusing on when you're at those extremes. And counterbalancing means that you never go so far that you can't find your way back to the middle. And you never stay so long at the extremes that there is nothing waiting for you when you return. So you never stay so late at work working on your one thing that your family is asleep when you get home and you can't tuck your kids in at night. That's kind of how I read that. And you never go so far to the extremes that you don't really know what the middle is. And all of a sudden you're lost and you're working long, long hours, and now you don't know, you can't relate to people back at the middle, and now you're losing relationships, etc., etc., etc. Gary quotes this study. There was an 11-year study of 7,100 British civil servants, and they found that habitual long hours can be deadly, and they actually showed that individuals who worked more than 11 hours a day were 67% more likely to suffer from heart disease. Counterbalancing is not only about your sense of well-being, it's essential to you being well. And there's two types of counterbalancing: the balancing between work and personal life, and the balancing within each. To achieve extraordinary result, you must choose what matters most, give it all the time it demands. This requires getting extremely out of balance in relation to all other work issues. But you know what? It takes awareness to do that. It takes a lot of awareness to do that. So you have to be aware when you're at those extremes and not stay out there too long and not get lost out there. So the question becomes, do you go short or long? And Gary writes here, in your personal life, go short and avoid long periods where you're out of balance. Going short lets you stay connected to all the things that matter most and move them along together. In your professional life, go long and make peace with the idea that the pursuit of extraordinary results may require you to be out of balance for long periods. Going long allows you to focus on what matters most, even at the expense of other lesser priorities. In your personal life, nothing gets left behind. At work, it's required. So at work, on your certain skill set in business, think long term. Personal life, short term. Stay connected. Keep the relationships. But at work, you're going to have to get at those extremes, but counterbalance it to come back. And again, life is just a balancing act. Just get it through your head that you will go out of balance at some point. But the challenge is how long you stay out of balance. You don't want to stay out there. You don't want to live at the extremes. But you do need to touch them every now and again to get where you want to be in life. So just summing up the big ideas from this chapter, think about it like you're balancing two buckets. Separate your work life and personal life into two distinct buckets. Don't compartmentalize them. Each has its own counterbalancing goals and approaches. So again, when you see that there's too much water on one end, you can carry it like that for a while, but then make sure you pour some water into the other end. Make sure that side gets a good workout, like you're carrying the pails on the sticks, like it's a squat, like a barbell, and you got the two plates on both sides. Counterbalance your work bucket. View work as involving a skill or knowledge that must be mastered. It's going to cause you to devote a lot of time to your one thing. You will have to take what matters to the extremes and be okay with what happens to the rest. Counterbalance your personal life bucket as well. Acknowledge that your life actually has multiple areas and that each requires a minimum of attention for you to feel that you have, quote unquote, have a life. Drop anyone and you feel the effects. This requires constant awareness. And there was a quote earlier that Gary mentioned from a book, Suzanne's Diary for Nicholas, and it mentioned how You're juggling these balls: work, family, health, friends, integrity. But you come to understand that work is a rubber ball. If you drop it, it'll bounce back. But the other 4 balls, family, health, friends, integrity, are made of glass. You drop one of these, it's irrevocably scuffed, nicked, perhaps shattered. So that's why you don't want to live at the extremes of work, because those other areas are glass, very fragile. And guys, that's going to do it for the one thing, Chapter 8. Next time, we're going to wrap up this section on the lies that they tell you about success. We've got Chapter 9, Big is Bad. And then after this, we're going to work into Section 2, Part 2 of the one thing, which is the truth, the simple path to productivity. So tune in next week. We're going to talk about the lie that big is bad. And thank you guys so much for listening. I really, really appreciate it. Check out the blog. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comment section. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care.